Good evening. My name is Juliane Campfield. I'm the director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our 7th annual Margret and Volkmar Zander Prize award ceremony. We are absolutely delighted to award this 7th award to Dr. Susan Neiman, who is of course here in the first row, and thank you for traveling here while you have an incredibly busy schedule thanks to your international book tour. Really appreciate making the effort to find this date. I know it wasn't easy, but it is wonderful to have you here and to have Sandra Gilman here and Joan Reutershan and all of you, of course. Thank you for coming and being here tonight. Susan Neiman is the Distinguished Director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. Born in Atlanta, Georgia, Neiman studied philosophy at Harvard and the Freie Universität Berlin. She was professor of philosophy at Yale University and Tel Aviv University before coming to the Einstein Forum in 2000. She's a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Akademie der Wissenschaft and the American Philosophical Society. Her works include Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin, The Unity of Reason, Rereading Kant, Evil in Modern Thought, Fremde, Sehen, Anders, Moral Clarity, A Guide for Grown-Up Idealists, Why Grow Up, Subversive Thoughts for an Infantile Age, Widerstand der Vernunft, and most recently, Learning from the Germans, Race and the Memory of Evil, which is the book that she's currently on book tour with and which I highly recommend to all of you. As most of you will know, the Volkmar and Margret Zander Prize was established by Professor Margret Zander in memory of her late husband, Professor Volkmar Zander, former head of the German department at NYU and the founding director here at Deutsches Haus at NYU, who worked here for many, many decades. The prestigious annual prize, which was awarded for the first time in 2013 to the late Fritz Stern, to Gary Smith in 2014, to Leah Friedrich Pfeiffer in 2015, to Klaus Leggevi in 2016, to Carsten Vogt, we just talked about that, in 2017, and to Henry Jarecki last year, is endowed with a $5,000 grant and honors individuals who have made outstanding contributions to the cultural, political, and academic relationship between the German-speaking world and the United States. Deutsches Haus at NYU continues to be very grateful to Margret Zander for establishing this annual award, thereby providing Deutsches Haus with the opportunity to honor such worthy and distinguished individuals such as Susan Neiman, whose work has been instrumental for the enhancement of transatlantic dialogue and, of course, dialogue in general, now more needed and necessary than before, perhaps, at least before recently, one should say, both of which are so important, a real Herzensanliegen, I believe, for every single one of us in this room. Please let me also thank the friends of Volkmar and Margret Zander, who have been strong champions of the prize and of Deutsches Haus at NYU for many, many years. I'm therefore delighted to now introduce Joan Reutershan of the Friends of Volkmar and Margret Zander, who has kindly agreed to say a few words on behalf of the Friends and extend a greeting by our Preisstifterin, Margret Zander. Please come, Joan.
So, everyone, good evening. Honored Zander Prize recipient Susan Neiman and Sandra Gilman, and NYU German Department and Deutsches Haus colleagues, especially Director Juliane Campfield, and guests. I'm Joan Reutershan, and my history with Deutsches Haus goes back to its inception in 1976. In those years, I was founding director of the language program here, as well as assistant and then associate professor in the NYU German department. Retired now from NYU, I'm one of about 80 members of a group called the Friends of Volkmar and Margret Zander. After Volkmar passed away in May of 2011, our friends group formed rather spontaneously at a memorial celebration of his life in the fall of 2011. We're all former colleagues, co-workers, and students of both Volkmar and Margret. Many of us are still active in teaching, translating, and cultural exchange. We stay in touch on the internet and look forward to attending this prize event every year. About 15 of us are here tonight. And we're all gratified that our work and affiliation with NYU and Deutsches Haus continues under Juliana Camfield's expert leadership as director. Though each year's Sander Prize winner has had a career of distinction, I can't tell you how many regrets I heard from those who could not be here to meet Susan Neiman, who addresses issues at the heart of ethics and citizenship that are of urgent concern to us all. My most important message this evening is one of congratulations to Professor Neiman from Margret Sander, who created this distinguished award. Margret is living in a small town near Frankfurt, and I'm in frequent contact with her. She sends her gratitude to Susan Neiman for her outstanding work and her greetings to all in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Let me also thank my wonderful colleagues, interns, project assistants, program assistants, our videographers, our photographer, for working tirelessly behind the scenes to make all our events happen, but of course, especially thanks for tonight. And you're a great team, and I truly appreciate your camaraderie and teamwork under all kinds of crazy conditions. Thanks also to my great colleague Uli Baer, who kindly connected Susan and me many months ago, and whose podcast, or rather his interview on his podcast, Think About It, his interview with Susan about her recent book, I highly recommend to you. So once this is over, go home, listen to that podcast, and you will learn more about this fabulous new addition to thinking about memory and Vergangenheitsbewältigung in many different contexts. Thank you, Uli. I see you are here. I didn't know you were here, but thank you. It is a great privilege for us that tonight's laudation will be held by Dr. Sander Gilman, whom I now have the pleasure of introducing to you. Sander L. Gilman is a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and sciences, as well as professor of psychiatry at Emory University. A cultural and literary historian, he's the author or editor of well over, how many books do you think? 90. Not a typo. His Stand Up Straight, A History of Posture, I'm trying to remember that as I'm standing here, stand straight, right? Was published by Reaktion Press or Reaction Press in 2018. His most recently edited volume is the Oxford Handbook of Music and the Body with Yoon Kim, published in 2019 by Oxford University Press. For 25 years, he was a member of the humanities and medical faculties at Cornell University, where he held the Goldwin-Smith Professorship of Humane Studies. For 6 years, he held the Henry R. Luce Distinguished Service Professorship of the Liberal Arts and Human Biology at the University of Chicago. For 4 years, he was a distinguished professor of the liberal arts and medicine at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he created the Humanities Laboratory. He has been a visiting professor at numerous universities in North America, South Africa, the United Kingdom, Germany, Israel, China, and New Zealand. He was president of the Modern Language Association in 1995. He has been awarded a Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, at the University of Toronto, elected an honorary professor of the Freie Universität Berlin, an honorary member of the American Psychoanalytic Association, and made a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Sander Gilman. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you very, very much. I'm delighted to be able to have a small role this evening in the award of the 2019 Volkmar and Margret Zander Prize to Susan Neiman, the director of the Einstein Forum in Potsdam. But let me begin to give you a sense of the importance first of Volkmar Zander, who created the Deutsches Haus. Volkmar was a formative factor in the reestablishment of Germanistic in the United States after the 1960s, and one of the most important translators of the Germanic literary and cultural experience for the Anglophone readership in the mid-20th century. As a young Germanist in the 60s, my own exposure was to a world in which the German literary and cultural past ceased with Weimar. That made me, and not only me, supremely uncomfortable. I sought out for my teachers in the 60s, those few scholars in West Germany, such as Eberhard Lemmert, who were beginning to confront this absence. Volkmar Zander's own trajectory from Frankfurt to Pisa to Oxford, then his decades-long commitment to New York University and to transcultural German studies was based on an understanding and advocacy of what were then contemporary writers, from Martin Walser and Gabriele Wohlmann, from Heiner Müller to Pavel Kohut, all of whom spoke in this room. These were the writers across European culture dealing with the legacy of the Third Reich, oftentimes in uncomfortable ways. Such an exposure to writers and thinkers across the widest reach of German and European letters and culture cemented Zander's understanding of the communal complexity of the divides present in the age of the Wirtschaftswunder and Germany's concomitant refusal to mourn. Volkmar's commitment to the moral education of his students, to their exposure to the hard lessons of modern German culture, was without question and without peer. This commitment underlies the importance of the Zander Prize, and perhaps is also the very reason for its being awarded to this year's prize winner, Susan Neiman. It's difficult for me to praise Susan, if I may call her Susan. I have long held her to be the exemplary academic and public and intellectual in a number of arenas I call my own. I think of her truly as one of my teachers. I discovered Susan in 1992. By the way, like Columbus discovered America, right?
No, actually.
Right? When I was asked to review, when I was asked to review her autobiography, Slow Fire, Jewish Notes from Berlin. In the early 90s, I was in the process of examining something that should not have been. The rather sudden reappearance of a German Jewish, not necessarily with a hyphen, creative literature in both Germanys. My interest had been piqued by the appearance of a few novels set among Jewish worlds in Germany, West and East. And I was invited by the then cultural attaché of the German embassy in Washington, himself a Jew, to speak at an event at the embassy on what was then considered to be a rather remarkable rebirth. My talk was academic, pedestrian, and if I say so, very boring. But unbeknownst to me, in the audience was Yochanan Meroz, one of the retired ambassadors to the BRD, to West Germany from Israel. I'd known him by reputation because his father was Max Marcuse, one of Freud's great debate partners in the 19-teens and 1920s. I finished my talk, 45 minutes to the minute, and Meroz raised his hand and asked the first question. he was the elder in the room. I immediately called upon him. And he asked me, was there really a rebirth of German Jewish culture in Germany? I responded that the very hesitant beginnings seemed to be present. He stood up, he exploded at me. He said, even if I were right, and he doubted it, it could not, should not ever be. I returned that evening to Ithaca, realizing that I had stepped on a landmine. When I was a student in West Berlin in the 60s, as I've mentioned, Jewish culture was understood as that great absence in in contemporary German culture, epitomized by Weimar culture. It was the loss. How could it be a presence? I thought, could there be something that could never be? If Jewish culture indeed began again to exist in the here and the now. And then the invitation to review Susan's book on living Jewish in West Berlin came. And I spent long and hard thinking about this while I read it. As a result, I organized what turned out to be the first of now many academic conferences on the topic of Jewish culture and life in post-war Germany, and invited, of course, who else but Susan Neiman to speak. Her book, as many of you know, was sharply written, funny, exhausting, and most importantly, an answer to Moroz's complaint. Yes, there was a Jewish opening. It would be hard. It would be complicated. It would be contested. But it was also possible and perhaps even necessary. Susan's sense of place and time was perfect. Irony was the only tone that could be used at that moment, and used best by a philosopher whose worldview was that of the Enlightenment, not the anti-Enlightenment. Susan's own personal situation in the Yale philosophy department at that moment in the 1990s was perhaps part of this. A department alienating to its young female members, including my own sister-in-law, a world in which they existed, but perhaps should not really have existed. Her struggle moved her to Tel Aviv with her family. Family begun in West Berlin, continued in New Haven, and then a type of enforced exile. An aliyah, maybe a yerida in Tel Aviv. There she began to work on what became, in my estimation, one of the most important philosophical texts of the late 20th century. Evil and Modern Thought, an Alternative History of Philosophy, which appeared in 2002. It dealt with a topic rarely engaged in the world of analytic philosophy, but which harked back to her own training under John Rawls and Stanley Clavell at Harvard, and her mentorship by Michael Walzer. What is evil? And how can its history, from its evocation at the destruction of Lisbon to the Holocaust, be understood to frame our inheritance from the Enlightenment? The book's trajectory took the reader from the theodicy of Leibniz to the death of God in Auschwitz and beyond. Can we understand suffering? Is progress negated by evil? Is God really dead if we cannot understand the very nature of evil? Pace Adorno or Pace Hannah Arendt? Must we struggle to understand evil, to comprehend our world, to understand ourselves? It was the Enlightenment and not the anti-Enlightenment, Arendt and not Adorno, that commands her and our attention. I learned much from Susan's book, and what I learned certainly shaped my recent book, which appeared here at NYU Press, Are Racists Crazy? Questioning the role of mental illness as the explanation for evil acts, from well before the Holocaust to the mass murders at Columbine and El Paso. From her, I learned that we must acknowledge evil to understand human actions without attempting to provide rationalizations for evil acts. And it was indeed to Arendt that I turned over and over for the rudiments of my critiques, following Susan's lead. Susan's books moved us to rethink much about our historical location, from examining our struggle with evil as a key to what she called moral clarity, a guide for grown-up idealists, the title of her 2008 book. There she demands that we understand our own position in the universe to make sense of the implicit moral codes that we all have internalized, whether like Nietzsche, we claim to have none at all, or like Kant, that we see such codes as implicit in all order within human society. Her examination of our fetishization of youth, Why Grow Up, of 2015, continued to trace the trajectory of our worldview as growing out of that of Rousseau, Kant, und die Folgen. This world of Enlightenment moral order, focusing on what have become the hidden codes through which we are habituated in society, Richard Rorty, to not only certain views, but to their concomitant action, is at the heart of Susan's project. Recently, and I suspect the reason for today's award of the Sanders Prize, Susan has looked at the moral order in both post-war Germany's and in post-bellum America. It's funny how we're comfortable with the phrase antebellum, but so uncomfortable with its analog, post-bellum. Her extraordinary book, Learning from the Germans, Race and Memory of Evil, of 2019, asks the hard question about why the United States after the Civil War seemed to have learned little or nothing from the act of vanquishing slavery until the post-civil rights era in the 1960s and 70s. The Germans, both East and West, began their dealing with the past, often fragmentary, forced, self-conscious, in the East already in the 1950s, and in the West, as I certainly experienced, only in the 1970s. Indeed, at approximately the same moment, the struggle for voting and civil rights was at its most difficult and vicious in the United States. I will remind you, if you have forgotten this, that this was not only the struggle for Selma, but also the struggle for Boston. And from my own experience in the 1970s, the struggle in upstate New York against the John Birch Society at the very same moment over the very same issues, the implicit legacy of the Civil War. Susan's work frames these questions through wide-ranging interviews in the United States and post-war Germany over the question of memory and guilt, of action and passivity, of monuments and their legacies. Whether the now vanished statue of Robert E. Lee dominating Lee Circle in New Orleans when I was an undergraduate at Tulane and periodically visited the West German Consul General, housed under the shadow of Robert E. Lee, to that memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin, now a favorite place to picnic and take funny selfies. Susan's argument that the GDR, the communists, already invested in an anti-fascism seared into their political consciousness in Weimar and the Third Reich, as well as through the murderous rampage of German forces into the USSR, started earlier and perhaps a bit more seriously than the compromised conservatives of West Germany, has indeed caused a bit of a rumpus. But that the United States, some 50 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, still seems to be debating, as that great American statesman Ted Cruz recently put it, whether anti-fascists are really as bad as the white power bullies of the Proud Boys, seems to draw her hard question of our being able to learn from the Germans into focus. Indeed, such lessons seem to be necessary not only in the United States, not only in contemporary Germany, but certainly in large parts of Central Europe today. Susan has been awarded a wide range of honors, from the International Spinoza Prize to the Lucius Clay Medal for German-American Relations. One has to mention here in this context that Lucius Clay, who was the commandant of West Berlin during the airlift, was also Harry Truman's greatest opponent when he tried to integrate the armed forces, successfully integrated the armed forces. Today, Susan is being awarded the 2019 Volkmar and Margret Sander Prize. It is the most recent of a series of well-earned honors. But given the creators of the prize, given Volkmar Sander's own legacy and the institution that they served, I would think it is certainly one of the most fitting. Thank you, Susan.
Please join me now in welcoming Susan Neiman as I award her, on behalf of Deutsches Haus at NYU, the 7th, exactly, the 7th Volkmar and Margret Sander Prize. Very much deserved. Thank you so much for all the great work you've done, and it's an honor to award you the prize on this special occasion. And Susan has agreed to deliver a few acceptance remarks.
Thank you, Juliana. I actually did find time to make some notes this afternoon and promptly left them in my hotel on the way over. So if I'm a little rambling, please forgive me. First of all, Sander, thank you so much. I thanked, when Juliana asked me if I had any thoughts about who I'd like to give the laudatio, the first, perhaps only person who occurred to me was, well, how about Sander Gilman? I thanked him for his willingness to do this. I know it takes work to write a laudatio. I've done a few myself. And he said, well, it was either that or an obituary. So I'm not planning to kick the bucket yet. But I have a lot of things to thank Sander Gilman for, and I want to begin by responding with that. First of all, I think somebody may have forgotten to give Sander this prize, because as far as I know, Sander was the first American Jew to make Germany kosher again. Even when I came in 1982, 20 years after Sander first went, I got a lot of, what shall I say? There was a lot of hostility. What's a nice Jewish girl doing going to Berlin and for a whole year? And well, is your family German? No, absolutely not. I'm an Ostjuden through and through, as far as I know. But Sander was there 20 years before me, working on German, in addition to the 27 or 28 other fields that he's mastered, working on German literature, German history, German Jewish literature and history. But I didn't actually know any of that when I went to Berlin. Unfortunately, I did get a fairly good training in philosophy, but at least the way I was brought up, one just read philosophy. Everything else was kind of, well, maybe if you're sick in bed with the flu, which is when I first read Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I allowed myself to read something that wasn't Kant or Hegel because, you know, I was sick after all. You know, I'm grateful to my teachers, but studying philosophy in Emerson Hall, and I fear many places in this country still, is a rather provincial affair. So I had never heard of Sandra Gilman until the publisher of my first book, Slow Fire, sends me this blurb. And Sandra, you did discover me in the sense that it was the first time that someone I didn't know wrote this rave about a piece of my work. And you know, while you're grateful for your friends or your teachers or whatever, it is a moment when a perfect stranger reads something and loves it and invites you to your first academic conference. Little did I know how many there would be thereafter. And that's a second thing that I have to thank Sandra for. When I was teaching philosophy at Tel Aviv University, and I wasn't actually looking to leave, but a number of people came to me and said, the Einstein Forum is looking for a new director. Wouldn't you like to apply? And my first answer was no. I've got 3 kids. We're settled here. I said, well, do you even know what the Einstein Forum is? I said, no. And as it was described to me, I realized that it was a job with my name on it because it involved having 1 foot in academia and 1 foot in the rest of the world and trying to straddle those 2 things, which is actually what I always wanted to do. I did not start out reading Kant. I read Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir when I was a kid. That's what made me want to be a philosopher. I know it's kind of funny. It's not as if it's that they had ordinary philosophical lives. So I put in an application, and it turned out that the chairman of the board was Sandra Gilman, who I guess I hadn't seen since those 7 or 8 years when he invited me to the conference at Cornell. I don't know what went on exactly behind the scenes, although I do know that when one of my daughters, then 9 years old, asked me, well, what exactly is this new job that we're moving to Berlin for? And I tried to explain it to her. I mean, kids understand if you're a teacher, right? You're just a teacher for big folks, but what is this weird job? So I started to explain it to her, and she said, but you're not just going to invite your friends like Ava and Yuli, are you? Now, it turned out that Yuli Tamir at the time was a minister of education in Ehud Barak's government in Israel. And Ava Iluz was not yet, but would become one of the most distinguished sociologists of her generation. But they were my friends, and I did wind up inviting them to the Einstein Forum. And I told this story to Sander, and I said, look, are there kind of ethical problems here? You know, what should I do? And of course, not really realizing it's not so easy to get people to jump in an airplane for the lousy 250 euros that the Einstein Forum is able to pay in honoraria. And Sander laughed and said, we asked a lot of people about you, Susan. You have great friends. Go ahead and invite your friends. So I do have great friends. One of them is Sandra Gilman, and I thank you for, I also have to, I made notes. Sander, when I was appointed then as head of the Einstein Forum in 2000, said, well, I think I'm done with chairing the board. I said, we just stay on another year. And he was a perfect mentor in the sense that he did not try to impose his vision. At the time, there were things we disagreed about. He really just simply helped me to fulfill and develop mine. Explained things to me about the workings of German and Brandenburg bureaucracy that I had no clue about. And I know he's been the perfect mentor for many, many people. So thank you, Sander. I want to thank the prize committee, and particular, please convey my thanks to Margret Sander. There are honors without honoraria. Those are mostly the kind that I get, as a matter of fact. But among other things, I am the single mother of 3 children who are now grown and employed, but not entirely self-supporting. And this prize came at absolutely a very welcome time. So in the name of my 2 youngest children, who I was able to help out, please thank Margret Sander for me. So my first thought when I received the note from Juliana was, oh boy, this is great. This is really good news, because Shira needs this and Lila needs that. And yeah. But my second thought was different. And I thought of my friend, the brilliant philosopher Bettina Stangnet, who I interviewed for my book, and who was extremely skeptical about my thesis, and said, and I quote her in the book, "You're going to be embraced to death, and you're going to be embraced by the wrong people." Now, actually, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I don't think you knew about my book yet when you gave me the prize, because it wasn't out.
I had heard from Uli about it.
Ah, okay.
But you were
Thank you, Uli.
You were on our list of awardees beforehand.
Yeah, I didn't think that it was because, you know, let's give a prize to somebody who's saying rah, rah, Germany. Which I say with a qualified rah, rah, but it does make me nervous. And it makes me nervous, or even more nervous. I thought of the essay that I just read a few days ago by the journalist Richard Schneider after the attack. Atina is nodding her head. After the attack on Yom Kippur in Halle, who said to be a Jew in Germany today is to be a Persilschein, and I'm leaving for Tel Aviv. Now, I wonder how long he'll stay. I did my 5 years in Tel Aviv, and I certainly wouldn't be tempted to go back. But the question of how and how far to function as a Hofjuden is one that I'm confronted with fairly often. And there are times when I don't mind playing it. It's become the case, well, it's been the case since the war in Iraq, that when or Hof American, I suppose, when the German media wants a left-wing American who can speak presentable German about most things, but particularly about American policy, they call me up. That's okay. When the committee for the Einstein Jahr in 2005 wanted not necessarily somebody who happened to be the head of the Einstein Forum and rather amusingly gets to speak in the name of Einstein, something I was nervous about for a while. But having read so much of Einstein's work, his political and ethical work, not the physics, he actually spent more of his life as a public intellectual defending socialism, fighting racism, segregation. It wasn't just the, you know, the letter, the exchange with Freud about peace, you know, who's against peace, but he actually put himself on the line and was threatened both in Germany and in the United States for that. So again, I don't mind speaking in the name of Einstein, even though what the committee really wanted was somebody to tell them if what they were doing was kosher. It wasn't. It often wasn't. I remember a meeting at which the Wissenschaftsministerin at the time put out a draft of a brochure listing Einstein as a Mitbürger jüdischen Glaubens or something like that. And I raise my hand and say, you know, actually Einstein made fun of that phrase. It's a ridiculous phrase. For Jews, Jude ist kein Schimpfwort. And the minister says to me, "Oh, really? Thank you, Frau Neiman. This is just what we want to know." But they never changed it. I kept bringing it up. It's still very hard for Germans to pronounce the word Judo or Juden. Some things don't change. But I don't mind functioning in that capacity in some situations. I certainly drew the line when the AfD, the Brandenburg AfD, came to visit me about a year ago, wanting legitimacy with a Jewish American who's the head of the Einstein Forum. And I said to the guy, you cannot get me with Islamophobia. I'm not Henrik Broda. To which he responds, this is a real kicker, "Ach, haben Juden unterschiedliche Meinungen?" Right, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. But that was the view of the AfD. So anyway, but I want to say a few words in, let's say, defense of my thesis, to which, namely, that Americans have a lot to learn from the slow, faulty, messed up process of Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung, to which not only Bettina Stangnet, but many Germans, either they laughed in conversation, you know, "Oh, hey, Susan, what are you working on these days?" "Well, I'm writing a book called Learning from the Germans." Either they burst out laughing. In one case, actually, I was having dinner with Michael Naumann and his wife, and Michael starts yelling at me in the middle of a restaurant. "You cannot publish a book with that name. You are whitewashing. We did too little, too late." And again, the sort of implicit accusation was, if I wrote this book, I would be the Platonic form of the Hofjuden, right? Looking for, you know, acclamation from the wrong kinds of people. I've decided that precisely that reaction from a huge variety of Germans proves my point. And of course, there would be something perverse if Germans didn't make that claim. It would be rather perverse of anybody, even if we're talking about an individual crime, for someone to say, "Yeah, we really committed a terrible crime, but didn't we do a great job at atoning for it?" I mean, that sort of, you can't say that. I get it. But the very way in which basically almost everyone I know seem to feel, no, there's lots more to be done. There's, you know, and our start was very slow and faltering, confirms my view. When I first came to Berlin in 1982, lots and lots of people told me that their parents, or their parents and teachers, were Nazis, or anyway, Mitläufer. They were ashamed. They felt the need to tell me. They were often estranged from their families. They often decided not to have children of their own as a result of that. But nobody went so far as to tell me my parents were Nazis and they thought they were the worst victims of the war. That is something that actually I think people were too ashamed even to voice. And so it was in the process of doing the research for this book that I started reading things that were written in the first couple of decades after the war with a sense of incredible shock. And I asked people, was this like really standard? Of course, that was the standard view. So the standard view was, and some of you are nodding, and I'm sure you, perhaps you knew this long before I did. Well, we lost 7 million people and a third of our territory, and our cities were destroyed. We were hungry, just barely alive. I hope someone gets that reference. And on top of that, those ignorant, vulgar Yankees are trying to tell us it was all our fault. And there was a moment in the South when I had this epiphany, and I realized, it's the night they drove Old Dixie down that I was quoting, and for everybody who doesn't have that wonderful song in their head, but I was driving down the road, I think last fall, on the New Jersey Turnpike, going from one academic conference to another after my first academic conference. And the song came on, and I'm trying to keep myself awake, you know, sing along to the radio, and all of a sudden I realized, I can't sing that song anymore. And, you know, it was Bob Dylan's band. I mean, Dylan went down to Mississippi when it was dangerous to go to Mississippi. Baez covered it, went down to Selma. And Sandra's exactly right. It's not just about Selma. The entire nation took over the lost cause narrative. You know, it's kind of cool to be a rebel. Anyway, and somehow realizing that the first generation of post-war Germans sounded exactly like people who trumpet the lost cause philosophy was enormously helpful to my friends and colleagues in Mississippi who were working for social justice and racial reconciliation, because this is the good news. The good news is that Vergangenheitsaufarbeitung is really hard. And even if you're a Nazi, it's hard, right? And it takes time, and there's going to be resistance, and there's going to be pushback. So of course, if the New York Times publishes the 1619 Project, Newt Gingrich is going to throw a fit. That's to be expected. And that's the first thing that we can, the rest of us can learn from the Germans, is how very hard it is. But it's possible. It's also not a one-shot deal. It's not an inoculation. And I have to say, Sandra, you were left on a just slightly skeptical note about whether or not this is a process that could happen in the United States. It's happening. And when, right before the book was about to come out, I was sure I was going to get hate mail. I had my personal email address taken off the Einstein Forum website because I thought I was going to be barraged by people from all different sides. It'll be interesting to see what happens when it comes out in Germany in March. I don't, you know, I expect quite different reactions, but I expected hostile reactions from many people in the States, and I have gotten the nicest letters from the widest variety of people, and I have been speaking all over the country for the last 4 weeks. Yesterday, I was in a moderated conversation with a rabbi at the JCC in Fort Lauderdale. The JCC, right, who does Holocaust education. And could not have been nicer, and talked about this being a paradigm shift, and, you know, all kinds of things. So, I mean, I'm going to end on what my silver lining note of the month is. I mean, I'm a silver lining kind of a person, but honestly, it's been very hard these last few years. But one effect of this administration, for which no Schimpfwort is strong enough, I've stopped even trying to find them, is that I think it has brought white America to realize how deep white supremacy has run in this country. In fact, if you think about it for a second, where would you have heard the word white supremacy 3 years ago? You would have been in a Department of Postcolonial Studies, probably, or you know, not looking at the New York Times or the Washington Post or listening to the ordinary media. And it's not the case that those of us who knocked on doors for and thrilled to the election of Barack Obama thought that we were moving towards, moving into a post-racial future. But the moral arc of the universe really was bending in the right direction. And suddenly it didn't. And I think for white America, the realization that all of this stuff is not just a blip. Okay, we know there was slavery, but then we had the Civil War. We know there was segregation, but then we had the Civil Rights Movement. The sense that white supremacy and all that's connected with it runs much deeper than any of us were ready or willing to face has actually made people willing to accept lessons from the Germans. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you very much for this prize.
Thank you so much for sharing these insightful Betrachtungen, observations. We'll now have to do a little bit of gear shifting because after learning from Susan, we're going to move on to listening to the Schumanns, which is a bit of a stretch perhaps, but I hope we'll round things out with this beautiful performance by Clara and Robert Schumann, performed by Devony Smith and Danny Zelibor. I want to thank the performers. I also want to thank Mike Brofman from the Brooklyn Art Song Society, who kindly put us in touch with them. I also want to thank the friends again, without whom we wouldn't be hearing this, because they provided us with this beautiful upright Steinway many moons ago. So we'll now hear 5 Lieder and their Widmung: Mondnacht, Der Nussbaum, Liebst du Schönheit, and Warum willst du andere fragen? And if you don't know what that means, you know what I'm going to say. Take a class here at German House. Anyway, so we have to put in the shameless self-promotion, of course. But now giving a warm welcome to our wonderful performers would be the right thing to do. So thank you. What an extraordinary and moving performance. Thank you, Devony. Thank you, Danny. Now we have to do some gear shifting again. More thank yous. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Sander. Thank you, Joan. Thank you all for coming. I think we've all been able to pick up a lot of new thoughts and inspiring ideas. Let's hope that things get better politically, but more importantly, let's do something for it. Yes. But let's also not forget to celebrate and be happy, even though these are tough times. We have to find a balance, and I think we can do both. In that sense, join us for a glass of wine, have something to eat, continue to learn from each other, talk with each other, disagree, keep up the dialogue. Thank you for coming. See you next year for the next Sander Prize. Thank you, everybody.